Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, as ever, to the front pages, and Labour's tax plan making a lot of the splash headlines. We'll fund spending by raising tax on £80,000 earners, says Labour in The Observer, and the party is responding to those bad polling results with extra cash for health and schools, it says. A rather different tone, you may notice, on the Sunday Telegraph. Labour tax to hammer workers on £80,000, all those £80,000 workers. The Sunday Times, with its rich list, has gone alliteration crazy. Brexit brings bonanza for billionaires, it says, and they've got the Labour tax story there as well. Finally, a lot of coverage of poor Zoe Ball's loss. Husband died. And then there's the Sunday Express, May's June Revolution. That's looking forward to the Tory manifesto, which it claims will be Labour's death warrant. We'll talk about that later on, I'm sure. But much to discuss, and above all, the election story. Aisha, you've taken the front page of the Sunday Times. There's a lot of interesting detail in that story.
Yeah, there is. So Labour has very much tried to get back on the front foot after some very difficult local election results with what will be a popular policy lean for Labour supporters. There is a lot of concern about inequality. There's a lot of concern that public services are not getting the adequate amount of funding. So I think a lot of people will think, yeah, this is good that the Labour Party is saying those who earn more should be spending, giving a little bit more to pay for these services. Now, as ever, the devil will be in the detail. We don't know when the manifesto is coming out. We'll need to see how much this money is going to raise and exactly where it is going to be spent. So I think people will think it's good that Labour's come out, but there is still a massive issue about credibility with the Labour Party.
A very interesting story there, in the same story, about how Labour is expecting to be judged on these results, because it's suggesting it's not just about the number of MPs they get, it might be the share of the vote, and comparing that to Ed Miliband's performance last time round.
Yeah, this looks like this has come from, you know, somebody close to Corbyn, and it looks like it's a preemptive strike to shore Corbyn up against any potential leadership challenge down the track if the general election doesn't go so well for Labour. Now, this is not really the right way to be looking at things. Labour is about winning seats. That's what a political party exists to do. So instead of looking at vote share, you've got to be looking at performance, and that is winning parliamentary seats. And
we've been obsessed by vote share and stuff after the local elections, but Tim, you could argue that actually the most important political news of the week was the ongoing row between the government here and the EU Commission over Brexit. That was a big splash in The Observer.
Absolutely, yes. The local elections have been fascinating, and it's been a brilliant week for the Tories in that sense. But actually, are the long-term implications on Brexit the thing we will remember from the last few days? I've always been a Brexit supporter, and passionate Brexit supporter, but I've always thought it's quite important for us to create, not just get into the detail of the Brexit negotiations, but create an environment in which Europe wants to do a deal with us, that we tackle the idea that somehow we have rejected Europe as a continent, as a civilization, that we want to separate ourselves from them. And 6 days after Donald Trump became president, Theresa May was off to the USA making a very pro-American speech. How long has she been Prime Minister now? There's never been a big pro-European speech in Prague or Berlin.
We like you, we're fond of you.
A declaration of love with Europe. And instead, what we've got this week is almost like a declaration of war. And I'm worried about the mood music for the context of these talks.
She was responding. You were disconcerted. I saw your tweets by what she was saying outside Number 10. But on the other hand, she was responding to very, very aggressive briefing by Juncker and others into the German press and across the Europe. In a sense, I don't want to sound like a playground person, they started it.
they may have done, and it was easy to understand why she was provoked. But the initial response from Downing Street was this was a private meeting, we don't comment on leaks, and that to me sounded quite grown up. It sounded consistent with the Theresa May, the strong and stable Theresa May that we're being presented to as the Prime Minister that the country needs.
One of the things is there's so much posturing going on over Brexit at the moment from both sides, and while it's important to a lot of people in the election, certainly when I've been going around the country doing my tour and talking to people, people are worried that Brexit is overshadowing a lot of really important domestic issues that need to be aired in this election, particularly the health service and schools and education.
So we talk endlessly about the election, but many of us don't realise there is another election campaign going on almost in parallel. Now, Jim Waterson, you're political editor of BuzzFeed, and you've been doing some work on what's going on social media, and it's a very different picture.
Yeah, so at BuzzFeed we spend a lot of time trying to work out how technology is changing politics and the effect that it's having. And what we've done for this election is looked at made a social barometer, which is an attempt to see what people on Facebook, which is used by the majority of UK adults, are actually sharing about the election. And the end result is a very different narrative to the one that we see from newspapers, which overwhelmingly in this country lean to the right. It's a world where Jeremy Corbyn is doing far better than expected. It's a world where these are the evil Tory policies that the government is pushing on people. It's a world where that sort of story goes viral. But the most interesting thing is that alternative sites, sites with names such as The Canary, sites with names such as Evolve Politics, Squawk Box, are starting to reach and go viral as much as mainstream media outlets.
And this allows people who have no media background particularly. I think there's a teacher in the north, for instance, who has huge coverage.
One of the more popular blogs, which has had one post this week, which has reached maybe over 1 million people, which is comparable to the circulation of, say, a newspaper, is a guy who runs a blog called Another Angry Voice. And this stuff is going properly viral online. Now, in the same way that Donald Trump, during his rise in the US presidential election, needed his own media, he saw a new sort of media rise up for it. This is what's happening in this election. I'm not saying that this is going to win over voters. I'm not saying this is going to make a massive difference. This is Jeremy Corbyn supporters who feel they're not represented by the rest of the media, choosing in large numbers to go and look for news elsewhere.
And I'm a crusty old git, so explain to me, you've been talking about your BuzzFeed story focuses on Facebook, and I use Twitter, but I don't use Facebook much. That makes me odd, does it?
Well, if you go onto BuzzFeed.com now... well, if you go
even odder than I want.
If you go onto BuzzFeed.com now, you can see our analysis, but the main thing is that Facebook is reaching a far bigger number of people than Twitter. Twitter is where politicians and journalists like to hang out. Facebook is where the sort of common person in this country likes to spend their time. It's the person who's just got 5 minutes while waiting for the bus to have a look at the news, to take in some info. Twitter is where if you're really into the detail.
Do you recognise this rise of the alt-left, we could call it, rather than the alt-right in Britain?
I think what's interesting about this, there's a lot spoken about fake news, and I don't think this is fake news as such, but what this is it's hyper-partisan audiences. And on your Facebook site particularly, you are in quite an echo chamber. So if you're getting messages which you already agree with, they are going to be hugely amplified. So I think that rise of that very, very hyper-partisan kind of platform is going to eventually have an effect. Now, Jim's right, whether that has a huge knock-on effect in terms of how, like, it moves the needle when people actually come to vote remains to be seen.
And Tim, as a kind of respectable newspaper man in the past, you are tiptoeing gently into this world yourself.
Yeah, well, I used to run Conservative Home as well, which appealed very much to sort of Tory activists, and we just sort of gave the Tory activists, I hope, a very focused news feed on Tory news. But we were quite critical of the Tory leadership at times as well. And what I hear about this, in contrast, is it is just actually giving readers constantly what they want to hear. You're not then. It doesn't seem to be like an independent journalism here.
So the view is very much from these sites that if right-wing tabloids have been able to do this for years, why can't we take the same tactics and apply them to the left?
By the way, there is a danger as well where you can get into a bubble. So in 2015, we thought that because Twitter was so positive about the Labour Party and the polls as well, that victory was ours. And of course, sadly, that was
There is more
not
to
the
the world than Twitter, or even, dare I say it, Facebook. Not much more, but a little bit more. Now, turning to the wider world, Aisha, you've got the Sun story there on the French elections. It was in the news.
Yeah, this is
it's a very strange headline.
It's a very classic, brilliant Sun, WikiLeaks, very good kind of writer there. This is an extraordinary story. Another huge sort of cyber leak just on the eve of polling. There are quite severe reporting restrictions around what was sort of leaked. But clearly, it looks like there's, again, disruption going on with Western democracies. People, of course, are looking at Russia in terms of whether they are to blame for this. But all eyes are going to be on France today for this election. Now, Macron looks like he's doing pretty well in the polls. But I think, you know, Marine Le Pen is not going to go away. And I think the howl of discontent that a lot of people in France feel, this rage against the elites, tax, which we know is a very dominant narrative across many elections and democracies, is not going to go away. But there's going to have to be a quite a big, I think, inquiry into what this is all about.
Because this leak dropped just at the moment the French press were unable to talk about it because of their rules. And we must now wonder whether we're going to get the same kind of thing in our election, whether there's going to be attempts by the Russian hackers to interfere with the British election.
It'd be very, sorry, I mean, I think it would be very hard to imagine that they weren't at least trying in some sense. The interesting thing with this is they clearly hacked Macron's campaign. They then mixed it up with some fake documents and released it at a point when no one could report it, which suggests that they didn't really get anything particularly juicy, but they've decided to drop it nonetheless to muddy the waters.
Well, the tweet of the week, though, does belong to the Russian embassy, though, in London. After Theresa May made her attack on Europe and Brussels, they said, at least it's not us being accused of interfering in a British election.
Also, you could also argue that we're doing quite a good job ourselves. We don't need the Russians to get involved in terms of causing a bit of chaos in British politics right now.
A little bit of humour from the Russian embassy. That is interesting. Now, another big story today. It's that time of year. It's the Sunday Times rich list, causing the rest of us to sit over our cornflakes, sucking our teeth with envy. Jim, what is the story this year? It's the effect of Brexit on the richest people in the country.
It is the effect of Brexit on the richest people, and it's because Brexit has resulted in the pound's value falling, which means if you earn all your money overseas, or your companies do, or you have holdings overseas, and you live in Britain, suddenly you're maybe 20% richer. So if you're a billionaire and your stocks have shot up that much thanks to Brexit, on paper, you're suddenly worth an awful lot more. So it's the Hinduja brothers who are top of the list this year, but the main thing is seeing what happens when that money that's been overseas comes back to London, and suddenly it's a lot cheaper to bring it back home.
And Adele's in there as well, I gather.
Adele is worth 125 million, which is not bad for a 29-year-old.
A warm glow of empathy. On your tablet, you have there Prince Philip story. Lots of Prince Philip in the papers today, of course, looking back at his career as, if you call it a career, I don't know what you call it, his life.
Public service, a life of public service.
Life of public service. This is a tribe in Vanuatu?
Yes, that's right, a little island in the Pacific called Tanna Island, and they have regarded Prince Philip for decades as a demigod, the son of the mountain god that they worship. And they believe that should he come back to the island, that their crops will grow taller, that the sickness on the island will disappear. And so you can imagine that news of his retirement has hit him a little bit harder than it's hit some of us in the UK. He has, of course, said he's now, or Prince Edward has said in an interview, that he will pick and choose his public appointments. So he's not retiring completely.
South Pacific is in order.
Definitely.
I have to say, reading across the papers today, I don't think it is only Pacific Islanders who appear to regard him as a demigod this morning. Anyway, Stephen Fry, talking of gods and demigods, is in trouble with this is an old interview, wasn't it, in Ireland?
It is. This is an old interview from a couple of years ago where he was asked his views on God, he has played God in his time, and he said something like, well, if there was a God, why would all these terrible things be happening? Now, a viewer has complained, and it has been completely investigated by the police now under these blasphemy laws. And it does seem extraordinary in an age of free speech that, people are going to be the police are going to be wasting time investigating this as a sort of serious crime.
Well, the Republic of Ireland remains a very different culture. But since we're talking about God, that allows me to say thank you very much to all of you for a very, very good paper review. And
let's take a look now at what's on the front pages of the newspapers this morning. So we have got The Observer, which says Labour will increase income tax for people earning more than £80,000 if Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister. The Sunday Telegraph has the same story. It says more than 1.2 million people will face a tax rise if the plans are brought in. The Sunday Express says Theresa May plans to improve social mobility by making grammar school education a possibility for all children. The Sunday Times splashes on details of its rich list. It says there are now more billionaires than ever before. The Sunday Mirror leads with a story about the death of Zoe Ball's boyfriend, and the Mail on Sunday criticises a BBC drama for airing what it's described as a paternity slur against Prince Harry. Well, joining me now in the studio is the editor of Nottingham culture magazine Left Lion, Bridie Squires, businessman Ian Baxter, and the Press Association's Midlands reporter Alexander Britton. Thank you very much for being with us, ready to talk about the morning's newspapers. Well, it feels as though at least one party's coming up with enough policies to get us talking this election campaign. Labour's on the front page of lots of papers with what it wants to describe as its guarantee not to raise taxes for 95% of people, but the papers seem to have taken a rather different approach to that, don't they?
Yes, I mean, it feels like they're targeting people earning over £80,000 a year and describing them as the rich, really. And I think there's lots of people in London who might not agree with that. But look, you know, I think we need a balanced approach on taxation and on spending. But this feels like an appeal to Labour's core vote to me, and I'm not sure it will go down very well, particularly in the South East.
How about Nottingham, though? Do you think that this is the kind of policy that might appeal to people in this area, which, of course, people in the county council elections, lots of people switched to the Conservatives?
I mean, I think it's quite interesting that obviously it's come out on a day where the Sunday Times Rich list is already splashed over the front, so it's quite a nice sort of contrast. And I think in terms of sort of the East Midlands, you know, £80,000 is considered, you know, a very high salary around here, you know, as opposed to places like London. So if they're going for the 95% who wouldn't be impacted by that, it's probably not a bad strategy.
What do you think? Do you think it's a good policy for Nottingham? Or?
Yeah, I think obviously with Nottingham City being one of the sort of most deprived areas in the UK, I think people can recognise that it is, you know, it's a lot more than your sort of standard sort of 12 grand salary. Yeah, I think it could very well appeal to voters in Nottingham.
£80,000 is seen as rich then. I mean, it is the top 5% of
earners. But it does include, you know, some head teachers and some doctors and people running small businesses.
But not MPs.
Not MPs. There were, what's it, nearly 75,000?
Yeah.
Just underneath. Maybe it's that whole thing where you're never seen as rich, you never see yourself as rich, do you? It's always other people on slightly more than what you're on. A story we've got in The Observer, haven't we, as well, which is all about kind of the Conservatives kind of eating into Labour's heartland. I mean, this is what we really saw in those local elections, isn't it?
It's quite an interesting piece, really, that sort of looks at sort of the Conservatives trying to break new ground, really. They're going to places where they haven't been before, the idea of no-go areas. You know, a Tory MP was talking about here how they were amazed to be dispatched to Scunthorpe, you know, Scunthorpe, this steel town, Labour voting, and there's really interesting perspectives really from people talking about Jeremy Corbyn wants to talk about policies I want to vote for, but it's no good if you're never going to be in power. It's the idea that the man might have strong ideas and strong principles that people agree with, but when the Labour Party on the ballot form, you know, people seem to be hesitant. You see it in Nottinghamshire here, in Mansfield, the Conservatives seem to be sort of putting quite a lot of resources into campaigning there.
And that's a strong Brexit area, isn't it?
A strong Brexit area.
So maybe it's those areas that they're trying to target.
A 12,000 UKIP vote in Mansfield last time, so there is a chance it could turn Conservative, and that really would be a turn up for the books. I think Jeremy Corbyn doesn't connect in Nottinghamshire, unfortunately for him, but what he needs to do, I think, is turn the agenda to the NHS and education, rather than, of course, Brexit, leadership, NATO, those kind of things.
It's difficult, though, isn't it? Because I remember Ed Miliband saying that last time, so, lots of speeches about the NHS, lots of trying to get young people out to vote, and it didn't really work, did it, last time?
Well, the argument is he's not made here. Jeremy Corbyn's not on the ballot paper. This isn't a presidential election. If Labour fight 650 local campaigns, then they have a chance of doing better than if you have this idea that Jeremy Corbyn, you're voting for him, or Theresa May.
Now, there's an interesting story on the Sunday Express as well, isn't there, about Theresa May saying she wants to scrap the Mental Health Act and then replace it. What's your sort of view on this story? Do you think it's a welcome move from the Prime Minister?
I think where Theresa May sort of talks about years of burning injustice and aligning that with the Mental Health Act, and to me that just seems quite hypocritical when you think about all of the different elements that the Tories have implemented over the past few years. I don't know if anyone's seen the film I, Daniel Blake, who's a BAFTA award-winning film. That was based on the experiences of people from St Anne's Advice Centre in Nottingham, and the whole film sort of surrounds access to welfare and that kind of thing, and there have been massive burning injustices that have existed sort of throughout the UK that have had a massive knock-on effect to people's mental health. So when Theresa May talks about burning injustices, I think she can, you know, she really needs to take a look at what's been happening over the past 5 years in those kind of policies and how they've been affecting your normal working people. And, you know, there's talk of sort of an introduction of more mental health support in schools, which sounds all very well and good, but you know, government maintenance grants to local councils are being axed. They've continued to be axed, and they will continue to be axed, which then means there's going to be less funding for schools. We're expected to see an increase in the amount of children that are going to be in schools. So, you know, having that lack of support per child in schools is, again, you know, it's all about creating a balance here, and this sounds very well and good, like I say, but
a bit sceptical on the.
A little bit.
I'm quite keen to end with this story in the Sun on Sunday. I'm going to say this very carefully. Never mind the ballots. It's a sort of Theresa May interview. She's mocked up as one of the Sex Pistols, I think, because it's quite a startling image of her.
I think it's one of those sort of situations where the message is sort of detracted from by the messenger. You're sort of immediately drawn to Theresa May going punk, and she seems incredibly straight-laced. I'm not sure quite how she'd feel about that when she opens up a copy of The Sun this morning.
Years ago, I lived in Wimbledon, and Theresa May lived there too, and I knew her before she was an MP, and I can assure you she's one of the most straight-laced and serious people that you could ever... Not really, no. She's the last person I would see as a punk.
I can imagine, you were right. She probably had a sit-down interview with The Sun on Sunday, expecting a certain headline, opens the paper and thinks, crikey, that's not what I was expecting.
I wonder what Linton Crosby makes of all this. That's the question.
Thank you so much for your views on the stories this morning. It's always nice to kind of break out of London and get some different perspectives, so thanks very much for that.
And on the election, it is hotting up with policy ideas today. The two main ones, both on the front of the Sunday Telegraph. There is that Tory mental health story, but leading on this take on the Labour policy, they say it is a tax to hammer workers on £80,000 or more. It is an angle that has annoyed Team Corbyn. They point out the policy is about not raising tax for 95% of people, and they say these headlines are the establishment looking after its own. It isn't only the newspapers getting excited about the election. We have an election artist called Cornelia Parker, and here on Instagram is her right-leaning cat. Well, we had a right-leaning electorate on Friday in the local elections, and this rather clever chart helps to explain why. These are the parties that people voted for in 2015, divided into how they then voted in the EU referendum. And over here is the voting intention today. You see the Tories holding on very well there, not only to their Leave vote, but to their Remain vote too. Has Theresa May got beyond the Brexit divide? Clearly, these Remainers want her in the negotiating room. A much more mixed picture for Labour. It's lost votes at the other side. Some Remainers peeling off to the Lib Dems and to Don't Know. And you see there the Brexit voters going off in two different directions. And UKIP were crushed last week. You can see why here. Their vote really fragmenting, some of it going to the Tories. And here's my favourite bit of the chart. UKIP Remainers. Who knew? Robert.
I'm delighted to be joined by former Lord Chancellor Michael Gove, Tom Baldwin, a great advisor to Ed Miliband. Actually, you're both colleagues, weren't you, on The Times a few years back. We had this extraordinary sight just a couple of days ago of Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May agreeing with each other. Theresa May saying the victory for the Tories, or the victories for the Tories in the local elections weren't as brilliant for her as some people thought, and Jeremy Corbyn saying the results weren't as bad for Labour as many people thought. They're both wrong, aren't they? I mean, this was a disaster for Labour and brilliant for Theresa May, wasn't it, Michael?
Well, it was certainly a very impressive result for the Prime Minister and for the Conservatives. But I think that she's quite right to caution people that while local elections provide all sorts of data that we can pore over, and which Anushka has done so brilliantly, nevertheless, at the general election, different issues will impinge on the public consciousness, and there is no automaticity about how people voted in the local elections determining how they'll vote in the general election. So in that sense, she's absolutely right to be cautious, and similarly, I think Corbyn is absolutely right from his point of view to say that just because this was not a perfect night for Labour, that doesn't mean that Labour won't be competitive in some races that we don't anticipate at the moment.
But, I mean, Tom, losing the Teesside mayoral election, losing in the West Midlands, it's a disaster, wasn't it? For your side?
Totally, and it was an equal measure, both sad in terms of what we lost and terrifying for what it promises to bring in the general election. I'm desperately worried about the future of the Labour Party now. I feel that Jeremy Corbyn seems to want to stay on, even after defeat. He's telling friends, apparently, that he's halfway through a 5-year project.
Just to be clear, you think a defeat is utterly inevitable?
It certainly looks inevitable. We've got to now, I think, set a bar.
So the Labour debate is not how to win, it's how to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, for you.
It's about how we save the Labour Party and ensure we get as many Labour MPs as possible so there's a proper opposition afterwards, but also what is the test for Jeremy Corbyn in this general election? He, in 2015, said the 2015 result under Ed Miliband was a disaster, that we actually lost seats. If Jeremy Corbyn cannot significantly improve on that 2015 performance, win dozens of seats back, then he has to be out.
I've been getting